Hello, I'm Rod Dreher, and welcome to Conversations with Metropolitan Hilarion. Vladika, the Gospels were written long after the events that they recount, correct? When were they written?
There are different theories about when the Gospels were written. I personally believe that they were written before the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. Though there are many prophecies about this event in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, I still believe that these are genuine prophecies of Jesus Christ, which were recounted by the evangelists. There is, of course, a theory that the Gospels were written after this event, but I do not see any strong points in this theory. Now, by saying that the Gospel accounts were written long after the events that they describe, I think we may mislead certain people. Because what is the meaning of long? There are stories which are written several centuries after the events which they describe. While here, you probably had an oral tradition from the very beginning, from the apostles themselves. And I believe that the Gospels, at least some of them, were written during the apostles' lifetime, and according to the tradition, 2 of them were actually written by the apostles from the 12.
Well, why is oral tradition trustworthy? If you said today, somebody recalling something that happened 20 years ago, nobody would trust that. Why is it trustworthy from the ancient times?
Well, we are dealing with a very different culture nowadays and in the ancient times. We rely very much on written word. Whenever we want to memorize something, we write it down, either in a notebook or in some electronic device, because we believe that otherwise we will forget this. But even our generation is different from the young generation in the way, for example, that we all had to memorize dozens of phone numbers, which the young people nowadays never do, because they simply use iPhone, which memorizes it for them. And there are many other things which are different now from the ancient times. In the ancient times, most of the people didn't even read. They didn't have the ability to read. So it was almost exclusively the oral tradition on which they all relied. And then, of course, the stories about Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, they have survived in the oral tradition, as I believe, in a more or less fixed form. Again, one can say how it is possible to fix a text in the oral way. But as an example, I can tell you that we memorize poetry, for example, and we memorize it word for word. And even if you are a child and you cannot yet read, you can still memorize a poem and you will remember it word for word for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I still remember poetry I learned in school as a boy.
And if you take the sayings of Jesus, they, first of all, I believe that he repeated them many times. Even in the course of the 4 Gospels, you will see that many times he repeats the same things. And he uses the same kind of formulae to have these teachings better understood. Then his way of speaking was very poetic. He used aphorisms, he used proverbs, and it was, I believe, very easy to remember such way of teaching.
If you go to a bookstore today, you will see a number of different translations of the Bible that each one differs slightly from the other. There have been, over the course of history, the church's history, so many translations and versions of the Bible. How can we know which one is the most accurate one?
Well, it's a long story, and you cannot cut it short. It begins with the very interesting fact, that actually Jesus Christ and his disciples spoke Aramaic, but no Aramaic sayings of Jesus, except for some few words which he pronounced and which the evangelists decided to include in the Greek text of the Gospels, survived. So from the very beginning, the teaching of Christ and his life was somewhat interpreted, because every translation is an interpretation. And we will probably never know how exactly sounded his words in his original tongue. Then there was a long history of this manuscript tradition, because there was no fixed text which was published and which was accepted by everyone, but there were manuscripts and there were various variant readings. And probably there is not a single manuscript which would be an exact copy of another one. So over the course of this manuscript tradition, many versions of the same sayings or of the same stories developed. And then the task of a contemporary scholar would be to choose which reading seems to be more trustworthy, which reading seems to be more corresponding to the original text of the Gospels. Of course, this relates to some minor points, not to the text as a whole. But there are places which are disputed by scholars, and there are places in which some scholars would use one reading and some other scholars would say, no, the other reading is preferable.
So what is Textus Receptus, and why don't we use it anymore?
Textus Receptus was the text which was elaborated on the basis of ancient manuscripts in order to produce a printed edition of the Greek Bible. And so it was used for several centuries until the critical scholarship looked more carefully at ancient manuscripts and discovered that some readings seem to be better in some ancient manuscripts than in this Textus Receptus. Since then, it has lost its status of Receptus. But there are also dangers in this approach, because sometimes it could be biased. For example, a scholar would believe that over the centuries the Church introduced certain things into the Gospel, and he would look for more original readings, and he would argue that, for example, in some place the Church added something which originally was not there, which may not necessarily have been the case. It is simply the understanding of this particular scholar or of a group of scholars that leads to these conclusions. So while this textual criticism is extremely helpful in many ways, one has to be also quite cautious about this, not to give it too much significance.
When did we have a completed canon of Scripture, the first official Bible?
Well, I think if we speak about the four Gospels, already in the 2nd century there was a canon of the four Gospels. And in late 7th century, St. Irenaeus of Lyon would say that there are four Gospels and there could be no more, no less, because there are four corners of the earth. And then if we speak about the entire canon of the New Testament, it's probably by the end of the 4th century that it was formed in the way it is used now. There were some texts which were disputed, for example, the second epistle of Peter, the Apocalypse, whether to include it in the canon or not. But finally, the church decided in favor of inclusion.
What I like about the story, though, is it shows that it was the church, the authority of the church, that set the Bible. So many people today think that the Bible was somehow just dropped out of heaven, but it wasn't. The church had to argue about it.
Yes, and also you may say that the church was a kind of workshop within which the Gospels were born, because they did not come out of the blue, they did not come from outside, they were born within the church. So from the very beginning, they existed in the church, and it was the church which decided which account is right, which is wrong, which is more accurate, which is less accurate, which should be included in the canon, and which should not.
Metropolitan Hilarion, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today.